We have a time converter on my
hello and good evening to everybody. Hope you can all hear what I'm saying. Welcome to the ECHA Zoom talk this evening. And this evening we have Dr. Johanna Strong, who's going to talk to us about Queen Mary and her legacy shortly. Just a brief bit of bio information then. She's from Canada, from Ottawa, or studied at Ottawa. Recently completed her PhD at the University of Winchester under the supervision of Dr. Ellie Woodacre and Dr. Simon Sandall, titled The Making of a Queen, the Effect of Religion, National Identity and Gender on Mary I's Legacy in the English Historical Narrative. Johanna's PhD thesis examined the ways in which Mary I's legacy was posthumously created and how this legacy is perpetuated through the period of the English Republic. The research has been featured in 2 Winchester Heritage Open Days, Hampshire Hist Bites episodes on the Team Queen's blog, with Tudor Dynasty on the Tudor Society site, on Talking Tudors podcast, and most recently in a series for Winchester Cathedral. And her first chapter was published in early 2022 in Valerie Schutt, I hope we got that name right, and Jessica S. Howarth's writing Mary I, History, Historiography and Fiction. If you'd like to know her research, but to follow her research, you can find her on Twitter and Instagram, etc., etc. So welcome, Johanna, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I will just get someone to let me screen share.
Oh, yes.
I can share my presentation.
Okay.
Perfect. I will get that going.
Yep, we can see that. Yep, brilliant.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I am lucky enough that they announced we have strikes going on, and I'm lucky enough that they announced them and did not count today. So thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm really happy that I can give this talk tonight. So as you have probably guessed, I'm going to be talking about Mary I, England's first crowned queen regnant. The first public instance of posthumous legacy creation for a monarch begins at the moment of their death, including how the new monarch responds to the grief of those mourning the late sovereign's passing, and what arrangements are made for the funeral and burial. Significant in Mary's funeral preparations was the creation of her wooden effigy that would, along with Mary's casket, form part of the funeral procession. This effigy provides interesting details to how England's first crowned queen regnant was remembered immediately after her death. Her body in the effigy remains bloated in what was previously mistakenly believed to be a pregnant state. She is portrayed as she most likely appeared at death, complete with the physical appearance which her illness caused. Mary's last will, written on the 30th of March, 1558, when she thought herself to be with child, as she wrote, presents Mary as a pregnant queen preparing for the dangers of childbirth, with the physical appearance pregnancy entailed. It was only on the 28th of October, 1558, when Mary added the codicil to her will, that she formally acknowledged, in her words, that God hath hitherto sent her no fruit nor heir of her body. Since an effigy's face was generally taken from a death mask, it's quite likely that the body too would have been created true to life. In terms of the tomb that Mary requested, Elizabeth purposefully ignored her predecessor's wishes. Arguably a result of the dismantling of the Abbey's altars in 1561, Mary was left buried without her mother in the Henry VII chapel in the north aisle of Westminster Abbey, in an unmarked tomb covered by desacralized altar stones. Tombs were still being built in the Abbey at this point, but Mary's was never begun. a signal that Elizabeth thought it was in her best interests to strengthen her own reign by minimizing the role of her Catholic sister and predecessor. At this point, Elizabeth was also still technically illegitimate and still barred from the succession according to the Second Succession Act of 1536. Even though her inheritance had been restored in 1543 by Henry VIII's will, legally, Elizabeth still had a tenuous hold on the throne. It was in her best interests to avoid anything which drew attention to herself as Henry VIII's second child, born after a deeply divisive annulment and remarriage. Physical sites serve as tangible evocations of memory, becoming sites of conflicted memory when different groups have oppositional narratives. Memorials, and of course in Mary's case, tombs as well, stand for a particular interpretation of a shared history, even when that particular interpretation means the erasure of one figure in favor of the portrayal of another. Visual survival is often necessary for the survival of memory. 18th century antiquary Brown Willis, in his visit to Winchcombe Abbey after the destruction during the Reformation, noted that the local people failed to remember the abbey because it no longer loomed large in their view of the city. If the size of funerary monuments is a testament to an individual's symbolic power of the political body, as Llewellyn argues, then Mary's exclusion from her own tomb is telling. She is remembered in only one line of the engraving on the tomb, which you can see on the screen here. And it reads, "Here rest we, sisters, Elizabeth and Mary." And it is solely Elizabeth who appears in effigy. The lack of tactile remembrance to Mary effectively erased her from public memory. Mary's removal from the visual remembrance of her life and reign partly explains her displacement from the historical narrative. When opposing narratives collide, the question remains whether one exists solely after the destruction of the other. Mary and Elizabeth's tomb is a site of conflicted memory, in which these opposing narratives have clashed, and one has been declared the victor. The Catholic memory of Mary has been buried literally and figuratively under the Protestant narrative of England. Beyond these first visual remembrances, there are a variety of factors which have influenced the continuing dominant representation of Mary in the English historical narrative, largely guided by perceptions of her Catholicism, her marriage to Philip II of Spain, and her role as a queen regnant. Going through this talk, I will explain each of these themes in turn, and then we'll break these themes down chronologically to give an overview of how these themes interact with Mary's legacy. First, we have this theme of anti-Catholicism, which the dominant English historical narrative embraces in order to dismiss Mary as a Catholic monarch, an anomaly to Elizabeth's Protestant identity. Building from that, we have the theme of anti-Spanish sentiment, which largely regards Mary and Philip's marriage as a threat to England, both intellectually and physically. And then we have this fear that Mary, as a queen regnant, will hand her realm to her husband when she gets married, and so will destroy England's independence. In the Elizabethan era, Mary's legacy ultimately rested on this fear of Catholic authority and supremacy in England. Portrayals of Mary's reign became increasingly hostile as the perceived threat of Catholicism to Elizabethan England grew stronger, and as English Catholicism was forced further underground. Superficially neutral sources, such as chronicles, often interpreted as the truth, are in fact subjective in their interpretation, creating and sustaining a specific historical narrative. By comparison with the Chronicle of Queen Jane, which was published contemporaneously to the events which it portrays, Holinshed and his colleagues wrote their chronicles, which effectively demonstrates how accounts written as events occurred and accounts written after the fact provide different interpretations and therefore highlight different aspects of the same events. In this way, Holinshed et al. Focus particularly on the dangers of Mary's re-Catholicizing of England and call attention to other anti-Catholic works, such as John Fox's Acts and Monuments. Since Fox focuses particularly on the theme of persecution, his work has a more thematic view, emphasizing in part not the individual events, but the way in which these events culminate to form a narrative of religious zealotry in Marian England. The fear of Catholicism evident in Holinshed and his colleagues' selection of events, and in Fox's disdain of Marian persecution, was further sustained in Book 1 of Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, which translates these fears into a fictional narrative, more readily recalled and relived in the popular imagination. In this cyclical way, chronicle sources influenced popular culture, which in turn cemented the chronicle accounts, all of which served to establish Mary as a firmly Catholic to the perceived godliness of Elizabeth and her Protestantism. As a result of the length of Elizabeth I's reign, England's developing anti-Catholicism, and this ultimate lack of long-lasting Catholic monarchs, English nationalism became, particularly during Elizabeth's reign, Protestant. In the place of saints' days were days of celebration of the monarch and the English monarchy, days to celebrate English Protestantism's victory over and suppression of Catholicism, and both continental and domestic plots. Elizabeth herself became a foundation stone for English Protestant nationalism, positioning Mary as competition, thus ensuring that in order for Elizabethan nationalism to succeed, all trace of Mary had to be either removed or vilified. As this Protestant nationalism emerged, there was no room for English Catholics to publicly commemorate their history, so distinct as it was from that majority of the English population. Forced to practice their religion in secret, Catholicism disappeared from visible English identity, thereby dismissing the need for a public challenge to or adaptation of the accepted Protestant historical narrative. The further this Protestant interpretation was cemented, further underground all other historical narratives were driven, in turn cementing this perception of the English historical narrative as being predominantly Protestant. A lack of publicly endorsed or publicly tolerated pro-Marian representations ensured the unquestioned survival of the English Protestant historical narrative, and the continuing existence of this interpretation ensured that all other voices were sufficiently silenced. The anti-Catholic nature of these sources works in tandem with Elizabethan fears of Spanish servitude, ultimately demonstrating the role of sources in creating multiple intertwining narratives of the historical record. As Spain and other Catholic countries increasingly threatened England, the English historical narrative during Elizabeth's reign became increasingly xenophobic and isolationist. As a result, Mary and her reign were vilified as the moment in time in which her marriage to Philip II introduced Spanish domination to England. While the Chronicle of Queen Jane relays moments of tension with regard to Mary's proposed marriage and its consequences, such as Wyatt's rebellion, who Wyatt you can see on the side of your screen here, this ultimate legacy of Mary's reign remains shrouded in mystery in the Chronicle of Queen Jane, because not enough time has passed yet for chroniclers and other history writers to judge the events. By the time of Elizabeth's excommunication, though, the Catholic threat posed by Mary Queen of Scots and her recent flight into England, and finally the Spanish Armada, really cement this narrative of Mary in a negative light. Many fears which had arisen during Mary's reign are now resurrected as moments in which England could have been subjected to any number of foreign religious and political powers. These moments being avoided simply by virtue of Mary's death and Elizabeth's accession to the throne. With the loss of Calais at the end of Mary's reign, there was no further reason to look beyond England's island shores to the continent for an English identity. England thus became even more isolationist and regarded with even deeper suspicion anything that came from beyond her borders, ultimately resulting in the anti-Spanish sentiment of the Elizabethan English narrative. Finally, gender and sex deeply influenced the legacy of Mary's reign throughout Elizabeth's time on the English throne. As long as a queen regnant occupied the English throne, reasons other than the perceived frailty of the female sex had to be found in order to condemn Mary's reign. As a result, the way that Mary's gender intersected with her Catholic and Spanish identities was brought to the fore, particularly in the memory of extensively gendered moments, such as Mary's pregnancies and the transition of the English throne from a queen regnant to a reigning king in 1603. The inability to blame female rule for the problems of Mary's reign resulted in an increased reliance on anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish feelings, which came to further define the English historical narrative during Elizabeth's reign. Mary's Catholic, Spanish, and gendered identities greatly influenced how this era perceived Mary's reign. And it was this Elizabethan vision of Mary which served as the foundation on which the Stuarts and their subjects based further development of this historical narrative. Throughout the reign of England's first Stuart monarch, James VI of Scotland, first of England, Mary's Catholicism, her Spanish identity, and her sex continue to influence and inform how the English historical narrative remembered her and remembered her reign. From anonymous libels to popular literature, such as John Reynolds' Vox Coeli, which you can see on your screen here. The anti-Catholic sentiment which surrounded the monarchical and popular response to the 1605 gunpowder plot served to further establish Mary as a perceived anomaly in the post-Reformation English monarchy, a Catholic in what became a firmly Protestant and anti-Catholic nation after 1558. This cult of Elizabeth, in quotation marks, popularly embraced at the end of Elizabeth I's reign and encouraged and developed by the regime under James VI and I, largely helped this establishment of England's Protestant identity. This cult, again, in air quotes, partly legitimized James's own seat on the English throne, presenting him, as one manuscript dedicated either to James or to Charles I phrased it, as a rose which was born a thistle. In order for James's reign to appear in the best light, Elizabeth had to be upheld as an ideal sovereign and a model precedent, in turn necessitating the denigration of Mary's memory, oppositional as she was to Elizabeth's Protestant and unmarried state. As a result, the anti-Catholic response to the gunpowder plot, the plotters you can see on the screen as well. So this gunpowder plot, in conjunction with the ongoing cult of Elizabeth and the growth of England's identity as a Protestant nation, served to further establish Mary I as an outlier in the English historical record. In addition to England's anti-Catholicism, as we saw in Elizabeth's reign, the anti-Spanish sentiment prevalent in the country encouraged popular disdain for the Spanish match, a series of marriage negotiations between England and Spain through the 1610s and 1620s, which would have paired England's heir with the Infanta Maria. Mary and Philip's marriage served as a precedent and a touchstone to demonstrate the alleged dangers of a Spanish marital alliance, with Stuart apprehensions influencing the early 17th century historical narrative's interpretation of Mary's marriage. Authors such as Reynolds in his Vox Coeli and anonymous authors in their libels relied on a thematic perspective, which rendered Mary and Philip's marriage synonymous to the Spanish match negotiations nearly 3/4 of a century later. Consequently, in order to counsel against the Spanish match, Mary's marriage was used as an example of the way in which an Anglo-Spanish marital alliance, no matter the detail in which the consort's role was defined in marriage treaties, could render England subject to a foreign power. Pervasive anti-Catholicism and anti-Spanish sentiment, however, were not merely factors in the early Stuart manipulation of memories of Mary I and her reign. These Jacobean understandings of Mary's life, reign, and legacy built on Elizabethan models of memory and legacy creation. The themes of anti-Catholicism and anti-Spanish sentiment during James VI and I's time on the English throne continued from the precedent set in the time of Elizabeth I, integrating and developing these themes for a new context. These same themes then continue to influence Mary's legacy in the reign of the next Stuart king, Charles I. Throughout Charles I's reign, Mary continued to feature in curated collections, chronicles, and popular literature as a figure embodying anti-Catholic, anti-foreign, and gendered sentiments of the age. As religion again divided England, exacerbated by Henrietta Maria's arrival, Laud's reforms, and the Civil Wars, Mary's Catholicism served anew as a foil for the present moment. Mary's historical identity continued to be in dialogue with the present, this time in Caroline, England. Fears of the return of official Catholicism via both Henrietta Maria's marriage treaty and Archbishop Laud's reforms led to some Stuart authors reminding their audience of the dangers Catholicism had posed in Mary's reign. Further, they used Mary's reign as a warning and a critique of the present situation, entering Mary into discourse and revealing as much about these authors' contemporary period in which they were writing as they do about Mary's life and reign. The retrospective view with which Mary's reign was seen further added to Stuart anti-Catholicism, given its sense of the inevitability of English Protestantism, as did these thematic perspectives embodied by some authors, particularly those who looked to Fox's Acts and Monuments as a source. Apologies. A reference and further reading for their own audience. In addition to heightening fears of Catholicism in England, the arrival of Henrietta Maria sparked renewed conversations about the role a foreign Catholic spouse played in the English monarchy. Stuart perspectives collapsed the time between Mary I and Henrietta Maria and Philip II and Henrietta Maria, rendering the perceived threat which Mary and her foreign identity posed synonymous with perceptions of the danger which Henrietta Maria presumably introduced with her arrival to and tenure in England. Stuart authors thus used this historical perceived foreign threat to respond to the perceived danger of Charles marrying a foreign spouse, particularly one who threatened to reintroduce official Catholicism, or at least toleration for English Catholics. Caroline authors such as Thomas Martin also framed Charles I and Henrietta Maria's marriage as a threat based on gendered facets. As in the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras, perceptions of gender roles continued to influence dynastic legitimacy, though sex played a smaller role in these Caroline discussions. While sex and gender appear to play a limited, though no less significant role in this, they really continue to affect perceptions of Henrietta Maria's fertility and motherhood. Comparisons reemerged between Henrietta Maria's role in English politics and in English religion, and of Philip II, both of whom served as monarchs, as consorts to English monarchs. Their parenthood, or potential parenthood in Philip's case, seemed to pose a threat to England's continuing Protestant identity, creating a connection across the decades. Even when England ceased to have a monarchy and developed into a republic, these themes of anti-Catholicism, anti-Spanish sentiment, and gender, which had pervaded Caroline understandings of Mary's life and reign, continued to affect perceptions of Mary's legacy. Religious divisions, antagonism towards foreignness and foreign identity, and questions of sex as they related to dynastic legitimacy greatly affected Mary I's legacy throughout the period of the English Republic. Despite the extinguishing of monarchy in England in 1649, Mary I continued to play a significant role in society during the English Republic, both in how it viewed its monarchical history, but also in how it understood its new identity as a republic. In a Puritan-controlled country, Mary's Catholicism continued to influence memories of her life and reign, serving for Billingsley, Fuller, and others as a precedent for mid-17th century recusancy, as well as a more general embodiment of evidence to why Catholicism threatened England's identity and stability. Mary's religious policies, including the reintroduction of official Catholicism to England and the persecution of non-conforming subjects, served as a stepping stone in this era, from the Tudor age to the religious tensions leading to and present during the Republic. Conversations about Catholicism more generally occurred alongside discussions of Mary's Catholicism more specifically, highlighting perceptions of both the perceived false nature of the Catholic faith and perceptions of the false identity of the monarchy more broadly. Beyond her religion, authors in the English Republic, such as Bacon and Fuller, highlighted Mary's foreign identity by birth and by marriage, demonstrating the extent to which the fear of foreign influence continued to pervade England during its time as a republic, and played a role in ongoing discussions of England's identity as a nation. Bacon in particular highlighted Mary's foreign identity by comparing her negatively to her sister and successor, Elizabeth I, whom Bacon perceived to be entirely English, as he put it. In a context which looked with fear at foreign attempts to return the monarchy to England and at Charles II's court in exile on the continent, these fears of foreign influence grew and thus affected how Mary's personal identity was remembered and reflected in mid-17th century representations of her life and reign. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain also played a significant role in the English Republic's understanding of Mary's reign, particularly since he was both foreign and Catholic, two identities which were seen to be at odds with the Republic's self-perception as an autonomous Protestant nation. Moreover, these religious fears and those based on national identity existed in conjunction with the English Republic's understanding of sex and gender, beliefs which influenced authors like Bacon and Fuller's discussions of monarchy, political authority, and dynastic legitimacy. While Bacon acknowledged within the confines of 17th century perceptions and understandings of sex and gendered expectations that women and children had held the throne more tenuously, he nevertheless argued for Mary's legitimacy as queen, pointing to the laws of succession in Tudor England. Fuller too focused on dynastic legitimacy as an aspect of Mary's reign, agreeing with Bacon that Mary was the next rightful heir after Edward VI, regardless of Edward's device for the succession. Both Bacon and Fuller wrote of Mary's sex and monarchical standing in an era when conversations about dynasty and succession were at the fore in English politics, especially once Cromwell, in the center, was offered, though ultimately rejected, the crown, as support for the English Republic faded. Although the themes of Catholic Mary, Spanish Mary, and Queen Mary continued into the English Republic from Charles I's reign, The context surrounding discussions of these themes had fundamentally changed, given that England was no longer a monarchy. Despite this change in political structure, memories, perceptions, and interpretations of Mary I's life and reign continued to affect and to be affected by the new historical environment in which the English Republic formed these memories, perceptions, and interpretations. Looking at this then more thematically, this talk has shown that from her death on the 17th of November, 1558, until the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Mary I's Catholicism played a significant role in memories of her life and reign, memories which developed into Mary's legacy as the English historical narrative portrayed it. In the Elizabethan era, authors such as John Foxe, Raphael Holinshed and his colleagues, and Edmund Spenser created the first iterations of Mary's legacy, focusing on the perceived harm her Catholicism and her religious policies did to England's Protestant population. In an age which necessitated the denigration of Catholicism as a result of continental Catholic threats to Elizabeth I and to her regime in England, Mary became a victim of this religious circumstance, resulting in this four-sided legacy for Mary, one which reflected at once both perceptions of Mary's faith and the Elizabethan environment in which these perceptions developed. In the Jacobean era, various libels and ballads negatively portrayed Mary's religious policies and her personal faith, presenting this as a point of origin for recusancy during James VI and I's reign in England. As Catholic plots and conspiracies threatened to overthrow England's Protestant regime, Marian Catholicism again served as a negative comparison, meant to uplift and justify James's reign. During the reign of James's son, Charles I, preacher Richard Hayrick and others existed in dialogue with their environment, with Caroline religious tensions and increased Catholicism at court as a result of Henrietta Maria's queenship. And this further cemented these authors' perpetuation of the existing legacy of Mary's Catholicism. Authors during the period of the English Republic also used memories of Marian religious policies to further denigrate Mary's life and reign in the English historical narrative. Nicholas Billingsley wrote extensively critiquing her faith and her religious policies, a result of the strict Protestant environment in which Billingsley found himself. His re-examination of Fox's acts and monuments and his broader criticisms of the Catholic Church both demonstrate the presence in Billingsley's work of a dialogue between memories of Mary's reign and current historical environments. Later 16th and 17th century regimes also used Mary's Spanish identity to develop and perpetuate her legacy. Elizabethan and Jacobean authors recalled Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain as a moment at which England was seen to be subsumed into the Spanish Empire, using their marriage as a warning both against potential Elizabethan marital negotiations and the Jacobean Spanish match. Holinshed and his colleagues' chronicles in the Elizabethan era and John Reynolds' Vox Coeli in the Jacobean used Mary and her reign to argue against marriage of English royal family members to Catholic foreigners. During Charles I's reign, Mary again stood as a threatening precedent for foreign influence in England, with authors such as Thomas Heywood highlighting the parallels between Philip II's influence and Henrietta Maria's potential effect on Caroline politics. Henrietta Maria's identity as the new Queen Mary also drew parallels between England's latest Catholic consort and its first crowned queen regnant, again a Catholic, again cementing Mary I as a threat to English Protestant identity. Finally, the English Republic's authors called previous historiographical conversations between Caroline's sources and Mary's reign. And these sources in the Republic used Mary's perceived Spanish identity to present her as a danger to the Protestant English historical narrative. Throughout these eras, Mary appears as an other, a tangible demonstration of what Englishness apparently was not. In order to cement their own legitimacy as leaders of the English people, subsequent regimes necessarily marked Mary as un-English, highlighting both her own Spanish heritage as well as her marriage to a Spanish royal. Not only did later authors portray Mary as reintroducing foreign control via her marriage and the official reinstitution of Catholicism, they portrayed the Queen herself as a foreign figure, contrasting her with the strong English identities which later monarchs and regimes were perceived to embrace. Consequently, the traditional English historical narrative portrayed Mary as a foreign element of England's history, a blight on the narrative which was at best forgotten and at worst condemned. Sex and gender, too, played a significant role in the creation and perpetuation of Mary's legacy. In the Elizabethan era, Fox wrote of Mary's attempts to pass off another woman's son as her own, a fear of foreign Catholic fertility and supposititious heirs, which continued throughout the reigns of James VI and Charles I. Beyond pregnancy and questions of fertility, Mary's sex also provided a new facet to discussions of dynastic legitimacy, particularly after the death of Elizabeth I. While Elizabeth reigned, Mary could not be critiqued for being a queen regnant, as any argument against gynecocracy, against female rule, would necessarily reflect poorly on Elizabeth. As a result, religion played a forefront role in Elizabethan depictions of Mary's life and reign. But once a king returned to the English throne, sex reappeared as a defining factor of Mary's legacy. Throughout James VI and I's reign, Mary's identity as her father's daughter supported her right to the throne, and thus the rights of her inheritors, Elizabeth and James. Given James's Scottish birth and potential perceptions of him as a foreign king ruling England, Jacobean authors highlighted Mary's sex and familial connections in order to establish James as the next heir to the unbroken dynastic succession in England, thereby negating any foreign identity he was perceived to have. In Charles I's reign, authors used Mary's sex as a cipher for poor rulership, indirectly criticizing Charles' reign by hearkening to Mary's. By the time of the English Republic, though, Mary's sex and its ties to dynastic legitimacy came to play an even more significant role. Once again used as a historic parallel of poor leadership, authors during the English Republic simultaneously looked to Mary's legitimacy in order to undermine Oliver Cromwell's authority, and calling for a return of the legitimate holder of authority, the exiled Charles II. As this talk has demonstrated, religion, national identity, and sex and gender played intertwining and mutually supporting roles in the creation and perpetuation of Mary's legacy, with different facets appearing at disparate times in England and in England's historical narrative. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Brilliant. Well done. That was an excellent talk. Some fascinating information. I've just been writing notes down actually as you've gone along, really. And I mean, I thought Fox was the agent provocateur in a lot of this propaganda with his Book of Martyrs and other such nonsense, and the myth that they created that a Catholic queen couldn't really be any good at all, mainly because she's Catholic, but partly because she's a woman. And I think misogyny did have some part in this, although obviously with Elizabeth being the queen as well, they had to be careful what they actually said at the time. But I think misogyny and gender was certainly some part of this. And, I think, that's an interesting angle to it. And of course, the xenophobia and the sort of Little Englander mentality of some of the people at the time. And that Anglicanism was synonymous with English and Catholicism was synonymous with foreign, therefore dangerous, strange and unpleasant sort of thing. It was part of it as well, wrapped up with the political threat of Spain and then of course the 1605, the Gunpowder Plot, and all the rest of that, where they were, a lot of it was based on fear, wasn't it? Ignorance, fear, and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting things that are in there. And I mean, perhaps you could suggest some books that people could read. I mean, Eamon Duffy's Fires of Faith is one example, but there are many others. What other sort of books are there that people could look at?
Yes, there are all sorts of ones. I think for a general overview of how Mary's sex and gender affects her queenship, the book that I keep going back to is Sarah Duncan's Mary I, which essentially is kind of a look at Mary's reign as a queen and looking at how that differs and how that remains the same to the reigns of kings. I think another really good one to look at is there's been, and I'm not just saying this because she's sitting in the room, Valerie Schutte and Jess Howard, their edited collections on Writing Mary I, looking at, I guess, Writing Mary I and Mary I in Writing, looking at how this legacy is created and looking again at Mary's reign and how the sources talk about her. I think those are again kind of the latest, and I would say greatest. It brings together, and I will perhaps only take myself out of that. It takes kind of the greatest new research into Mary, and I'm lucky enough to be part of it, which somehow feels very imposterish of me. But it brings together this new research that's happening. So I think those would be my kind of academic ones to get you started. Otherwise, I would suggest anything that Melita Thomas has written. And Linda Porter and Anna Whitelock both have biographies, which are both good. I think those would be my recommendations.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll end up here with a list about 40 feet long.
I know Linda Porter from Twitter, and yeah, that's good. That's good. I mean, University of Winchester seems to be a very exciting history department, and producing a lot of good scholars, it seems. But then I suppose you would agree with that.
We have good supervisors. They push us.
Yes. Well, good students, good lecturers, etc. Excellent. We've we've got some comments here. Yeah. It says one person, Naomi, I think, has said, would you be able to comment, please, on Mary's time living in Ashridge, near Berkhamsted Castle?
I wish I could. I know that's probably the least helpful answer that you tonight. I focus a lot more on Mary from her death on.
Yes.
And so to look at that, the best people to look at are probably the biographies of Mary.
Yes.
Looking, I think, especially at her time pre-accession. So I'm sorry that that's not more helpful. But
fine.
feel free, if you'd like to send me an email, I can try to find out in more detail who might know the answer.
Yes, that's interesting. It's just somebody put it in the questions. I think they have an interest in Ashridge, which is a National Trust place, isn't it? I've never, to my shame, actually been there. I keep meaning to, but never actually get round to it. Anyway, somebody else, Peter Stiffel. Oh, yes, Peter, we know, because he's done, yes, we know Peter. He's done an excellent talk, of course. Fantastic talk as per usual. So obviously you have a very good reputation there. When do you believe that the demonization of Mary began to collapse? That's an interesting point, actually.
Yeah, I think the demonization really begins to collapse. I mean, a few decades ago. It turns into, by the time we have H.F.M. Prescott's Mary, I forget the full title of the work, but she writes quite a thick biography of Mary, and she presents her as a very tragic figure. And so we have this shift happening kind of quite early on in the 20th century, this shift from a Bloody Mary to a tragic Mary. And so the shift from a cold, calculating, cruel queen to a queen who was just a victim of circumstance and was just doing what other people told her to, and did all of this because she was angry that her husband didn't love her and that he left to go to Spain, and that she didn't get pregnant, and that if she was pregnant, she lost the child. And so there's this perception, then that shift of, well, she's not bad, she's just misguided, or she's just kind of too dumb to know otherwise. And I think it's really only in kind of the last, I've got to remember what year it is now, in the last maybe 30 to 40 years that we've seen a real shift. I think especially in the last 20, 25 years, we've seen this shift towards saying, you know, maybe Mary isn't Bloody Mary, and she's not Tragic Mary, maybe she's somewhere in between. And that's often a hard point for Marian scholars, but also for people listening about Mary, because it is hard to talk about her reign and to kind of explain and contextualize the religious persecution, and at the same time be respectful of those who are being persecuted. There's that kind of, she thought she was doing the right thing, but at the same time, you know, that's still an awful way to die. And so trying to balance those two factors. And I think that the field has really started moving forward, that kind of any good biography, any good academic writing about Mary will show this really complex perspective. And I think now it's just that matter of keeping that going, and then kind of pushing that into the public sphere, is pushing that into TV, pushing that into film, pushing that into those public perceptions. And I think Becoming Elizabeth really did a good job of that, from the clips that I've seen of kind of complicating Mary. And that was a really long answer to Peter's question, but I think there's been a gradual shift of Bloody Mary to Tragic Mary to it's a very complicated Mary.
I agree with you totally. And education had a lot to do with that. People were taught, you know, the bits of history they remembered, oh, Bloody Mary and Elizabeth, good old Bess, and that sort of stuff, and then simplify it down to like a sentence or two. And I've had discussions with people online about, you know, because they're just plain ignorant often about Mary. They just think, oh, Mary, Queen Mary burnt people, that's it, that's all I know, therefore that's it, that's the sum total. But as you say, it's much more nuanced and complicated than that.
We were with some friends, we went to the recent, I guess it's still on, the ongoing executions exhibition at the Museum of London Docklands. And I mean, you got to be a historian. We walked in and we were very excited about all of the history. And we got about 5 feet in, and I turned to my friend and I went, look at this interpretation text. She goes, oh no, like what's happened? We've been in here for 2 minutes. And it was, unsurprisingly, a print from Fox's Acts and Monuments, which fair enough. And the text under it was talking about essentially, well, this is Mary I, known as Bloody Mary, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I just stood there and I thought, I'm in public. I can't have a go at this right now.
Yeah.
But just that thought of why do you have to say that? You haven't written that about anyone else in this exhibition.
No.
And I think, again, further rant that I will save for later, but just this kind of decontextualization of, you can't just put print from Fox's Acts and Monuments with no context.
No, you need to balance.
Which bothers me. But it's this kind of public perception of people that we go, you should know better, stop, but they don't.
I think there's a great difference between academic history and popular history, inverted commas, where people like sound bites and movies and various things and think they get the history from, well, I saw it on Netflix or something or other, so it must be true, or I read once, or my teacher once told me this story or something, rather than actually understanding you know, different sides of it. There are different sides of it. And I mean, I think after Fox and so forth and Hayworth, it was like a propaganda campaign. And as we've said, really, it's the demonization of Mary has fallen apart in recent years. And I think, personally, I think Eamon Duffy has had a lot to do with that, actually, with sort of with examining the whole period of the 16th century, really, and actually reanalyzing it and looking at the sources and going, oh, well, that's what you thought happened, and this is actually what I believe really happened. And I think that's changed things an awful lot. There's some people that still criticize Duffy and so on. I've read people saying that, but they can't criticize his scholarship, because I've never been able to find anybody who's actually been able to do that properly. But no, it's all very interesting. And anyway, we're just back to see if there's any more questions here. I think we've got a whole lot of things, actually. Wonderful presentation, Dr. Strong. It says, thank you very much, Tyler has said. What's the name of the last collection of essays you mentioned? Laura Dice says.
Yes, so I've put it into the chat. It's Mary I in writing, if that's one you're asking about.
Oh, I can see
and
that. Yes,
writing
yes.
Mary I.
Yes, I hope that answers her question, or anybody else's questions there. So brilliant. Stephen says, thank you very much, Johanna. Question from Whit Strong. As you pointed out, Mary I was strong woman stroke queen. If she had lived longer, do you think she would have allowed foreign, i.e. Spanish, influence over England? The threat of her detractors often raised. So I think that's a question that Duffy has actually examined as well.
Yeah, I think the answer would be not any more than any other monarch would listen to their spouse. Mary and her regime were really careful in creating the marriage treaty, that there were clear delineations of what Philip could and could not do, and clear delineations such as he's not allowed to control the forts. He's not allowed to control fortresses. He's not allowed to control the English military. And then clear delineations that if he decides that he would like to go back to Spain or to any of his territories, he cannot bring Mary with him unless she says yes and the council says yes. And if they have children, the children aren't allowed to be brought out of England without permission. And so these very clear lines on what Philip can and cannot do, which he was probably a little upset with, because as a king in the early modern world, he probably did not hear a lot of, you can't do this and you can't do that. But there are these clear limits on the influence that he is allowed to have. And I think instrumental in that is Mary, because at the end of the day, it's an international treaty that she has to agree to. And so I think she would have listened to Philip as her husband. She would have listened to him in the belief, as with many people in the early modern world, that the man was the head of the household, that a wife should listen to a husband. I think she would have taken his opinion into account, but I'm not sure she would have said, you know, I just don't want to do it today. Here, Phil, you do it. I don't think she would have handed that power to him. And one of the critiques that gets made about Mary is that this perception that Philip has this influence is because Mary doesn't make the most of the rights she's given as a queen, is she doesn't make the most of this unique position as a queen regnant, that she can tell her husband, kind of, you know, get lost, I don't want your opinion in this. And that she can say, this is my country, this is my rules, I'll listen to you if I want to. And so this critique that maybe Mary is a little caught in those gender roles. But again, I think that she is really careful that it is England first. And so when she marries, she marries Philip because it's a fantastic alliance for, you know, personal or professional reasons. It's a fantastic alliance. And she knows, you know, she needs, for England's stability, needs to have a baby. And to do that, to have an heir, she needs a legitimate child. So of course she has to get married. And so I think there's that tension between what Philip presents as a threat and what he actually is as a threat. And as Mary's reign goes on, Philip, his father Charles V abdicates as Holy Roman Emperor and all of these titles, and they get passed to Charles V's brother and to Charles V's son, Philip II. And Philip is increasingly physically absent from England. And so I think, had Mary lived longer, I think they would have seen that long distance relationship in a sense, because Philip has all of these roles that he's needing to do on the continent and which necessarily take him away from England. And so he might write to Mary, I assume he would write to Mary and would say, here are my 2 cents worth on this issue. But that ultimately Mary goes back to being kind of a single woman ruling who happens to have a husband in another country, if that makes sense.
I wonder if there's a sort of a parallel with Queen Elizabeth II and Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, that in no way was he ruling with her, but he might be there in the background giving her advice privately and whatever, but she could equally, she could just say to him, it's my decision, I'm doing this, that, or the other, and, whatever.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
but
absolutely.
I think Mary was quite an amazing woman. If you think about, she was the first queen regnant, and at a time that women generally didn't own property, that was generally owned by the male members of the family, fathers and husbands, and that and you think of the rights of women at that time, that a woman could actually rule on the throne in her own right is quite an incredible thought, and I think she should be celebrated for that alone, really, because it's such an important thing in history and a great symbol of empowerment for women. Really, I think she should be a role model for all women in many ways, rather than demonized and vilified by some people who are slightly misogynistic in their interpretation of history, perhaps. Anyway, that's some of my thoughts. Some other thoughts here. Do you think the historiography is in danger of overreaction on Mary?
I like this stirring the pot here. I think sometimes there is, I will say I'm sometimes guilty of this. There is the knee-jerk reaction when people criticize Mary and her reign. And you think, I've heard this 45 times already. I don't need to hear it again, kind of thing. And so there's that immediate reaction of, yes, but. And I think that's one of the jobs that we have as historians, is going, taking the PhD hat off and going, yeah, completely, like, I will fight you for my girl, like, I will protect her. And then putting that PhD hat on and going, okay, how can I justify, how do the sources justify this? And needing, in a sense, to separate that, however I personally feel about Mary, and then needing to say, okay, what do the sources say? And so I think any good article or book, whether it's written by an academic or written by just someone interested, sometimes those overlap. I think any good work will not 100% apologize for Mary. I think there are things that, as much as I think, she's a great queen, she did a lot for England, I can't talk about Mary without talking about persecution and saying, yes, in the context of the day, but that's still something that boggles my 2023 brain.
Yeah.
And
Duffy has that problem as well, that he very much celebrates Mary, but he does say it's a problem for me too. The fact that people were burned to death, but this was kind of their belief, their religious belief and the history of heresy and so forth in the church. So it was no more than what was expected of the time, and you have to understand it in the sort of milieu and the circumstances that she was in. that she didn't have absolute total power. She wasn't some kind of dictator. You know, some people may think, oh, they could do anything. They just click their fingers and somebody would do it. And it wasn't as simple as that at all. You know, there were other, you know, Parliament and Privy Council and various landowners, gentry, all sorts of, there were all sorts of different things going on. And it was not just one power center. And you can't blame Mary for everything anyway. And the church obviously had a lot to, you know, to answer for that, really. And she wasn't entirely responsible at all. But then nor could she go against some things that were current beliefs and attitudes. Moving on slightly, is Naomi's given her email address in the chat box, and she's interested in Ashridge and near Berkhamsted. So perhaps if you know anybody who can point her in the direction of some work on that, I think that's something she's interested in anyway. So that's good. Okay, yeah, I've seen your message as well there. Marie Romola Carre, did I pronounce that right? Becoming Elizabeth showed Mary first a strong, vibrant, passionate woman devoted to England and to faith. So,
yeah, it's a fantastic interpretation of the struggles that Mary has as a sister, but foremost as an heir, and looking at that Mary is this three-dimensional figure, and that world of the English court is very cutthroat. If you are not using your knowledge against someone, then you're doing it wrong. And I think it humanizes and three-dimensionalizes Mary in a really good way. And I think it got a lot of people thinking, you know, how do we represent history? And you know, is history that we got taught, you know, 40, 50, 60 years ago, has that changed any? Because the field's always changing. And so I could not agree more. It's a great portrayal.
It's interesting. There's so much about these women in history that's fascinating, like Henrietta Marie and Catherine of Braganza and so forth. That we weren't taught at school, that, you know, we didn't hear much about. It was all about the men. And I just think the role of women, and Mary, for example, but the role of women is so important, because I've been doing some work on Catholic recusant women, and I think it's so important. I mean, my view of Catholic recusancy is very strongly that Catholic recusancy would never have held together without the women who were holding it together. You know, the mothers who, you know, brought their children up in the Catholic faith, and the women who hid the priests and so forth, and people like the Vogue sisters who were hiding priests and funding them and all sorts of things. And I think the role of women in this period, or sort of Elizabethan, Stuart period and so on, needs to be emphasized far, far, far more than it has in the past. I mean, I couldn't find a single book on women and Catholic recusancy, for example, that's solely on that subject alone. I haven't yet come up with them. Maybe somebody has got one, but I haven't managed to find one yet. But yeah, anyway, we've got one or two more things here. I don't know how much longer you want to talk for, but I don't know whether it seems to be a statement. England did not get annexed to Netherlands under William III. It doesn't seem to be a question, but it's probably a statement. Well, we know that, don't we?
Yeah.
So
yeah, they stay very much separate, which is again really interesting for that. How much is the English monarchy prepared to kind of restrict the role of a foreign monarch? But yes, a really good point there of showing, you know, England is very clear that it will be England, and no one will take her over unless England says so.
it is a sort of little England mentality, really, of cutting England off from much of Europe, really, which began during that period, and some would say still prevalent today in some political quarters, shall we say, but we won't go into that. But I think that's that is something, a strain of any English character or English history, that, you know, we alone can do things, and we don't need these funny foreigners to do stuff for us.
Yeah, what lives in my mind is Alexander Sampson, and I'm sure he does not realize how much this line has affected how I think about Mary. Is he referred to her as probably the last Remainer, and the last time that England was really part of, or saw itself as being part of Europe. And I just thought, yeah, like this this hits, especially in kind of the political sphere, but that just the change that has happened in those 500 years and how that affects how we look at Mary.
Another question here, Jenny. Given that she was the first queen regnant, to what extent do you think this would have made her at risk of having her whole reign dismissed as an invalid aberration by the likes of Bacon, had she not been followed by a Protestant queen regnant of whose reign he approved?
Yeah, I think that's the big thing, is that Mary is the first. And so she fights a lot of the battles so that future queens regnant don't have to. And she sets that precedent. And I think that really puts her at risk because she has such a short reign, because she really sets the stage. And then Elizabeth comes forward and really kind of flourishes under that. I think there really is this issue that because she's followed by a Protestant, I probably skipped a generation, but then eventually by a Catholic who gets ousted, there's this very clear England is Protestant. And so post-Reformation, Mary is seen as that one-off. And so I think this really does put her at risk, as you say, of having this reign dismissed. It's just a blip, that it is kind of an accident of birth. But at the same time, she is by birth, by definition, should be queen. And that's something that kind of many Bacons, but especially Nathaniel Bacon is looking at. And I think that plays a big part, this dynamic, as you point out, between Protestant and Catholic, this dynamic of, can we support Elizabeth and Mary at the same time, which is still a problem that I think historians are coming to terms with. You can like both. You don't have to pick one or the other. So hopefully that answered that, Jenny.
Interesting. I did a Zoom talk just over a week ago about Catholic recusancy in North Oxfordshire. The point I was making was that Catholics and Protestants at a local level often got on really well together. And there's evidence from sources that they did live side by side. They weren't entirely persecuted. They were tolerated. They could go to private chapel, in this case belonging to the farmer family at Somerton. And interestingly, the connection between the farmer family and Charles I is that Juxon, the bishop who was with him on the scaffold, was at one time the rector of Somerton, appointed by a Catholic farmer, member of the farmer family, and who was obviously a strong Catholic, and Juxon was fairly pro-Catholic for the time, sort of thing. So there's an interesting connection between Catholic recusant families and Juxon particularly, and possibly some of the other bishops at the time of Charles I as well, actually. So let's see if there's somebody's mentioned a book here, Women in the Catholic Resistance by England, in England, sorry, by Father Roland Connolly. I haven't come across that book, but I will look up that book now, because that's...
It sounds fascinating.
Yes, no, it's something I've been looking for something like that, but I can't find... there's lots of books on Catholic recusancy and so forth, but not anything specifically which is about women. You get a chapter in a book and things like that, or somebody's PhD thesis, but not there's a book to be made there somewhere by somebody at Winchester, perhaps. Hint, hint.
Eilish and I will have to get on to it.
Yes. Well, yes. I think there are certain people at Durham, for example, who'd be interested in that sort of research area, probably. So there's a message here. Just trying to see what there's something. Oh yes, yeah. Stephen says, really enjoyed the talk. Always good to hear about Mary. Hope to see you soon, Johanna. Maybe at the ERRG book launch in Manchester in June.
Maybe. I will have to see. My teaching schedule is not the most cooperative sometimes.
Yeah.
So I can't make promises, but I try to get to everything that I can.
You can't do everything though, because that's not possible. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all we've got. Fascinating talk from Caroline, and
Thank you.
Jane says excellent talk. Thank you. So we totally concur with that. Fascinating, interesting talk, and loads of things to think about. So very, very well done, and well done for your research and for championing the cause of Queen Mary, because there are more and more scholars who are doing so. And we had the talk, of course, from Peter recently, and you know, we'll hear more about Mary, I'm sure, in the future, because it really is kind of putting things right in many ways. I just feel there's such an injustice done in the past, really, with historians and many academics and people who wrote books on her, and of course the TV stuff that you see as well.
Yes, that's the next frontier.
Yes. Well, maybe somebody should write something about Mary, you know, a film screenplay, and you know, something for Netflix on Queen Mary, and put things right. There's an
I
idea.
said, don't give Peter and I ideas.
No, Hollywood movie. That's possible. I'm sure you'll be working on that, or somebody will be.
One day.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thanks ever so much for the talk.
Yes,
So I
thank
think
you.
we've done all the questions and everything else. We've had a great talk this evening. So thank you so much. And anybody wants to message us with any other questions or anything else, please do so, and we'll see if we can get onto that. All right.
Wonderful.
Well,
Thank you so
bye-bye then.
much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.